Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on monitoring Windows Server 2012. Now, I'm going to tell you that when it comes to learning about monitoring, this is something that for me, being an instructor for so many years, one thing that I've learned is really when it comes to learning how to do this, it's not an issue of going through and actually practicing as much as just kind of knowing what tools are available to you and where to find them and the basics on how to use them. This is actually a little pet peeve of mine because I've attended many classes where I've sat around for days evaluating various systems and certain fake loads that we put on those systems so that we can see certain things work. And what I found at the end of those few days is if those few rare, isolated, fake scenarios were to ever play out in real life, great. I would know exactly what to do. But outside of that, nope. Don't really know anything more than if I would have just taken a few minutes and learned that there's some tools that I could use and go ahead and use them in the real world when things actually happen. So, if you've ever watched any of my stuff, whether it be just the other lessons in this course or the lessons from other courses, you know that I tend to give fairly lengthy, fairly verbose lessons. You're going to get a break here. This is going to be a fairly quick and to the point lesson, and we're going to jump right over into the operating environment, and we're going to take a look at 4 main tools that are available to us in Windows Server 2012. Alright, so here we are on a Windows Server 2012 computer. If you have been following along with the course as a whole, you'll recognize that I'm on a server that's called NYMem1. Right, this is a member server in the globalmantics.local domain, but I will tell you that that is not significant in any way, shape, or form. In other words, if you want to follow along, you could be on any Windows Server 2012 computer, whether it's part of a domain, whether it's not part of a domain, if it's a domain controller, if it's not a domain controller, it really doesn't matter. Okay, so here I am on a server, and the very first tool that I want to show you is probably the one that you would access most often. It's not a new tool. Matter of fact, none of these tools are brand new. This is a tool that most people are familiar with, and that is called the Task Manager. Now, there's a number of different ways to get to the Task Manager that we've learned over the years, but the way I like to do it is to come down here to the task bar, right-click, and select Task Manager. But check this out. Look at how simplistic they've now made this. There's basically nothing to it, and you're really seeing nothing in this case, right? This is a big empty window. Now let me go ahead and run an application. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Start, and I'll start to type in Calc for calculator. I'll open up the calculator, and the reason I did that, let me just move it out of the way, is so that you can see that Windows Calculator is open. Or if I come down here and open up the Server Manager, and then pop back over to the Task Manager, which got pushed into the background. Alright, well, now you see Server Manager and Windows Calculator are still running. And you'll notice that the most basic task that we do, and I shouldn't even say task, the most basic function that we do in the Task Manager, and we've always done since the Task Manager was first created a long, long time ago, is to basically take something that we don't want to be running anymore, or more specifically, if in parentheses here next to the item it would say not responding, which basically means the application has locked up. What do? We highlight it and we end task. Now let me do this. Let me go ahead and bring the calculator so you can see it over here, so that when I highlight it and I click end task, you can see that it goes away. Pretty simple, huh? Well, guess what? That's not all there is to the Task Manager. That's just the default view that we now see because Microsoft took a look at it and said, you know what? This is what people use the Task Manager for 90% of the time. So why don't we just make it simple and plain and non-distracting? But if you are going to go into some more advanced functionality, you simply click this little arrow down here that says more details and watch this. See, they give you this impression that it was just going to be a few extra details that were going to come, they were going to expand down a little bit. No, it opened up into a whole big advanced looking task manager similar to what we've had in the past. The interface itself is just a little bit different now. One thing that I do like is that they've now categorized, right? Where we're looking at the processes, we can see our applications. We have the server manager application. Heck, we even have the task manager application. And then we have background processes. We have a bunch of those running. We have some Windows processes, plenty of those running. Okay, so you see we've broken this down into different categories, but we still have overall up top here how much processing power we're using, how much of our memory is being used, and then we can see the breakdown of where that's all happening. Now, speaking of seeing where different performance indicators are happening, we also have our performance tab. And on our performance tab, you can see here that we can look at a very basic chart on our CPU utilization, or our memory utilization, or our bandwidth, our network utilization. Now, I'm going to come back to this tab in just a moment, but next I'll move over to the users tab where we can see the different users that are possibly currently signed in and using up resources on this computer. Here's a new tab that we haven't seen before, and it's the details tab, where other than the fact that end task still exists, right? So if I highlight server manager, I can still end task it. This is kind of a nifty little tab because now this is almost identical. Matter of fact, it is essentially the replacement for what used to be the processes tab, right? The processes tab is now showing all our applications, whereas the details tab is showing us the literal processes. Okay, so just kind of a change in verbiage, but otherwise still pretty much the same thing. And then we have our services tab where we can see all of the various services rather than having to go into the actual services utility itself. And if you want to go into the services utility, well, you could do so. You click right here and you say open services. Here's where we get our traditional services utility. Now, I said that I was going to jump back to the performance tab, and the reason why is because this is something that over the years, we talked about, okay, great, you come to the task manager, you can see some basic stuff about your processor and your memory utilization. Then they added in that you could look at your network utilization. But the reality is that this is very generic. I mean, other than maybe seeing that my processor is like maxing out, if it was way up here, it was just being maxed out or near 100%, it would show me, oh, okay, wait, we got something going on here. Other than that, there's not a ton that we're going to see here that's going to do that much for us. So if I want to get more sophisticated, I can then click this link right down here, which is taking us into a tool called the Resource Monitor. Now, the Resource Monitor is a great way for me to remind you that everything, when it comes to performance monitoring, it all relates to 4 main areas. Okay, we have all these different things that we can look at when it comes to performance, but every performance indicator, some way, shape, or form relates to either the processor, the actual disk, right? In other words, read-write performance from our disk, the network, right? Data traveling in and out on the network card, or our memory, our RAM. Okay, everything relates to that. Anything else that you can think of, in some way, shape, or form, it relates to these 4 items. Okay, so the Resource Monitor gives you a great way to give a full breakdown and look at all sorts of different aspects of what's going on with our processor, with our disk, with our network, and you'll see here that I have to blow this up and make it a bigger window so that I can get down here and look at memory. Okay? So this is just a great way to go ahead and get a more detailed view of what we get a very basic view of here in the Task Manager. And we do that through this tool called the Resource Monitor. Now, if we go ahead and close out of our Task Manager, we can jump into another tool that is handy to have around, and that is something called the Performance Monitor, right? If we're going to do performance monitoring, what a great tool to use, something called Performance Monitor. So basically, you'll see here that we have our basic monitoring tool, Performance Monitor, and we get a big blank window. Well, actually, it's not completely blank. You'll notice here that percent processor time is there, and it's also looking specifically at this computer, NYMEM1, and we get this chart that's being created, and we can watch this real time and see what's going on. But we could take that a step further. If I right-click and select Add Counter, you'll see here that there is a huge list of counters that we can look at. Okay, and to take that a step further, I'll tell you what. Each of these counters, each of these items that we see here, so if I go to processor, there we go, processor is highlighted here. If I click this little down arrow, you'll see here that there are many different aspects of the processor that we can look at, right? These are all the different counters that are involved with the processor. Then from there, even beyond all of these counters, we can then select what instance of this particular object that we want to look at. And so since I have this particular machine set up, this is actually a virtual machine we're looking at, but I set it up saying that I wanted to have 2 processor threads running. In other words, in Hyper-V, when I set it up, I said there are going to be 2 processor threads running on this particular virtual machine. Well, I can look at instance 0, which is the first thread, or instance 1, which is the second thread. So if I want to look at the 2 threads separately, I can do that, or I can put them together and look at all instances or the overall total. All right? So there are many, 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 many different counters that we can look at here. And again, I'm not going to bore you by going in and saying, well, let's configure all these different counters and look at this and look at all the different pretty colors and lines. I'm not going to waste your time that way. You are more than welcome, and matter of fact, I would encourage you to play around with it, have a little fun with it, put a counter in, and then do stuff on the computer and see what the result is. That's great. Now, we can take this a step further, because everything I've shown you so far in Performance Monitor, matter of fact, everything I've showed you so far in this entire lesson is all pretty much looking at things real time. Whereas here we have these things called data collector sets, where we can go ahead and we can gather data and form reports from that data. Okay, so here we have our data collector sets, and then of course they will then feed into our reports. Under data collector sets, here's user defined. If I right click, new data collector set, this is where I can go ahead and I can either use from a template, and there's a little nifty little how-to, help document. If you click the link, it'll talk about using some of the built-in templates that Microsoft has already given you. Not a bad idea. Or you can do it manually. If I do it manually, what kind of a data log do I want to create? Do I want to look at performance counters, look at different event traces, system configuration? What do I want to watch? Since we're talking about performance information, we would look at performance counters. Next, guess what? Here we have the exact same thing. Our performance counters, I click add. This window look familiar? Yeah, we have all our different objects and our instances, and therefore creating our different counters. Now I'm going to cancel out of here. We're not going to actually do this. And I'm going to cancel all the way out because I would have liked to have clicked back, but there was no back option. I'm going to go back and do another data collector set because there is one other thing that you can do. And this is a little awkward because in the past you used to literally just create a new what's called alert. Well, here I'm going to create a manually defined data collector set. And instead of doing a data log, I'm going to do a counter alert. Again, I would set up what counter. And then beyond that, you would then create an alert when you get above or below a certain threshold. So if I wanted to know every time my processor was utilized over 90%, we'll then go ahead and create that in here. Or it could be as simple as, hey, how about an alert for when my hard disk gets X% full? Okay, that's a great alert. Okay, so you can create those in here, and then from there, those alerts will go ahead and put entries into your event logs. And then if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, which is evaluating your event logs on a regular basis, you would say, okay, wait, we've got a problem. All right, so that's your performance monitoring tool. And speaking of the event logs, if I go here to the event viewer, this is one of the oldest and one of the best monitoring tools that was ever created. That's why it's still around. It has been modified over the years. There's not a lot if anything, that is really different in Windows Server 2012 from what we saw in previous versions of Windows Server. And I shouldn't say versions, but over the previous version, if you worked with the event viewer in Windows Server 2008 R2, it's pretty much the same thing. Here under your Windows logs, you have your application log. So this is anything that has to do with various applications that are installed. Your security log, which is where your auditing entries are going to be made. And I'm not going to worry so much about setup and forwarded events, but let's take a look at the system log. This is probably the #1 log that you'll look at on a daily basis, and this is what you want to see. You hope that you just see a whole lot of information. What you don't want to see, and I'm just kind of trying to scroll through here and see if I can find any, and yes, there are filters I could do, but hey, look at that. I have such a clean machine. Isn't that amazing? Oh, wait, there's a warning. You don't want to see warnings, although warnings aren't necessarily that bad. Warnings typically mean something didn't go perfectly the way it's supposed to, but you didn't necessarily experience a failure as a result. So it's just a warning. Whereas I apparently don't have any here. I think under the application log I might have seen some. No, not really seeing any there. Is basically you don't want to see an error. That would be the third choice. And yes, I can go ahead and I can set up filters. Okay, so I can go ahead and I can say filter the current log, and I can say only show me if there is a critical. And if I click OK, yeah, see, I don't have any critical. But basically, if you see a critical or an error type entry, what that means is a failure, something didn't go the way it's supposed to, and you truly experienced some kind of failure. Now, it may not have been a user-specific failure. Okay, in other words, the user may not have witnessed anything happen. It means that something truly failed on the system, but possibly in the background. Now, beyond here, and actually I should probably stop filtering that, so let me clear the filter. Okay, we also have, here we have different applications and service logs, but I want to take you up here to the custom views. This is something that is fairly new to the event viewer. It's not new with Windows Server 2012, but it is newer than if let's say the last time you used Event Viewer was Windows 2000. Okay, we didn't have it back then. But here you'll notice under each server role, and if you've been following along with the course, you know that I installed certain things like Web Server, which came along with Windows Server Update Services, and I had Windows Deployment Services. These are all things I've already put on this server. So I can look at specific views that are based off of that particular service. So if I want to look at things and see if they're working with that service appropriately, I can do so. But another thing that I can do is I can, under custom views here, I can create my own custom view. Okay, so instead of filtering one of the existing logs, I could go ahead and I can go based off of certain logs or certain sources that I want to evaluate. I can say what type of information I want. Okay, I can get very specific in what kind of view do I want to have here in the event viewer. And this is very cool. Okay, now again, typically, although we have all this really cool stuff, I think this guy right here, Windows Log System, is still the #1 viewed log in all of Windows Server environments. Okay, it's kind of handy. It's there. It's built in. It does its thing, and for the most part, it tells you the problems that you're having. But the one last thing that we have available to us are subscriptions. Okay, so, and it says to work with subscriptions, the Windows Event Collector service must be running and configured. Do you want to start it and or configure it automatically to start when the computer is restarted? I'm going to say no, but if it was, the idea behind subscriptions is I want to tell you that what you can do is, and this is, again, a fairly new thing. I believe this was first introduced in Windows Server 2008. The thing about subscriptions that's very cool is typically the event viewer was used to only look at events on a specific computer. Okay, so you'd go to each of your servers and you'd look at the event logs on those servers. I had a guy in one of my classes and he told me that he went into work an hour early every day, and all he did was go into the Windows system log, and that was it. Every day, that's what he did for an hour on every single server. Right? There was 100 servers, and he'd spend that first hour looking at 100 event logs like this. And that's probably still the same kind of thing that he would do today. But what you can do with subscriptions is you can go ahead and from a single server, you can go ahead and subscribe to these different event logs from different servers, collecting the information and putting it together. And the reason for this is if you're trying to troubleshoot a problem, very often in order to appropriately determine where the problem is and what's causing it and so on and so forth, you need to look at multiple servers at a time and see what's going on and see how they relate with one another. That's what we would use our event subscriptions for. So anyway, as I promised, very quick lesson. I'm not going to bore you with going through and creating fake simulated scenarios of performance thresholds being crossed and whatnot that that you'll never experience again in your life. But you want to make sure that you are familiar with those 4 monitoring tools. The task manager, okay, something you'll use on a regular basis when things fail, right? When you get not responding. You have your resource monitor, which gives you a little bit more sophisticated look at how your resources are being used if something's being maxed out. Your performance monitor, right? So kind of going in order here, is even more sophisticated if you want to evaluate a system. And by the way, in the performance monitor, I didn't show you. I showed you that we were looking at, this particular computer. You can look at another computer. Okay, from performance monitor, you could say, hey, don't monitor this server, monitor a remote server. And that's very handy, by the way, because if I am monitoring, let's say, how much of my processor is being utilized, and I'm doing it on this computer, well, I'm actually making the processor work harder on this computer just to evaluate this computer. So if I can use another computer to evaluate this computer, well, that makes a lot more sense. Now, the flip side of that is if what you're concerned about is network utilization, right? Your network card seems to be overutilized and you're trying to figure out why. You don't want to do it remote, because then doing it remote, you're further overutilizing it. Okay, so anyway, enough said about that. The 4th tool I will mention is, again, your event viewer. Handy tool, been around since forever. Yes, they continued to make the interface a little bit better and give you a little more flexibility, but great tool. If you're not ever looking at the event logs, you're pretty much asking for trouble, because event logs are a great place to see a problem before the users actually witness there's a problem. But that is pretty much all I have for you. Short lesson, or at least compared to the types of lessons I do, shorter than normal. So that's all I have, and I will see you in the next lesson.